There will be spoilers for Final Fantasy IX in this video. The turn of the millennium would also see the birth of a new Final Fantasy. With a desire to move back to the fantastical settings of the games from the Nintendo era, Hironobu Sakaguchi deemed that the theme of the next installment would be living, and he submitted designs and arcs for the characters well before development was even planned. The idea was to create a world that was boundless in possibility, an almost fairy tale-like universe that would effectively bring to life the imaginations of players who picked up the controller. This new entry would also act as a sort of celebration for the original games, harkening back with many references and playing on the idea of crystals as a key theme. For all intents, it would be a game that captured the essence of Final Fantasy, and come July the 7th of the year 2000, the outcome was Final Fantasy IX. And that's what my patrons voted for this time. It was very close between this and another Square title on the poll, but Final Fantasy IX did indeed win out, and I was excited because I have not played many Final Fantasy games to this day. 10, the 13 trilogy, 14, and Final Fantasy VII Remake. That is as far as my knowledge of the franchise goes, at least for mainline entries. So this was something that has been on my bucket list for a while. And just like many of the classics like Skies of Arcadia or Tales of the Abyss, Final Fantasy IX could not have started any better. In fact, I would say this is one of the best prologues I have seen in any JRPG ever. The game begins in the Kingdom of Alexandria, where a massive festival is taking place for the 16th birthday of Princess Garnet. The crowning jewel of this festival is a play conducted by the drama troupe Tantalus, who are going to be performing a favourite called I Want to Be Your Canary. Unbeknownst to festival goers, however, the troupe are also here on a mission to kidnap the princess, and will use the play as a cover to make it happen. As a result, this entire prologue sequence plays out like a theatre epic, with a setting of the stage, meaningful build-up, and a grand finale. The game's main lead, that being Zidane, is given responsibility for the princess's kidnapping. But plans never really go to plan, and that's because Princess Garnet intends to escape herself and sees the drama troupe as her ticket out. What follows is a humorous flow of developments while the play continues in the background, very much encapsulating that age-old quote of, "the show must go on." It really is excellent to watch. You're doing sword fighting mini-games, you're being chased by guards who are mistaken for actors, and there's a big payoff right at the end before the group escapes, complete with moves that are purely there for artistic flair. I do have to mention as well, the pre-rendered cutscenes have held up surprisingly well. No doubt the animation shows its age at points, but some of them are really impressive even now. One of my personal favourites has to be when the group first arrive in Lindblum and you get a full panoramic view of the city. It illustrates scale, there's intricate detail there, and it just really brings the world to life. Final Fantasy was always at the cutting edge of cutscenes when it moved to the PlayStation, but Final Fantasy IX's deserve a highlight, especially when considering how frequent they are. Now moving back to the prologue, what is so genius about this play sequence is that it pretty much foreshadows what Final Fantasy IX is all about. The idea of theatre and the influence of Shakespeare are not just seen in this opening section. The whole game is effectively a Broadway play, with a host of different acts and grand conclusions to each of the discs, of which there were 4 originally. It pretty much illustrates to you right from the off that Final Fantasy IX has gone back to its high fantasy roots, as intended by Sakaguchi himself. Now eventually the group do escape, but crash land in the eerily named Evil Forest, where Princess Garnet is taken by monsters shortly after. Zidane is joined by the upstanding yet bombastic captain of the Alexandria Pluto Knight Steiner, and an unassuming black mage called Vivi in order to rescue her, and the adventure starts from here. Now much of Final Fantasy IX in terms of exploration will feel quite straightforward. You have a large overmap spanning several continents, and upon interacting with certain locales on the map, you enter a more detailed variation of that zone, with dungeons in particular proceeding in a linear fashion. Towns on the other hand offer more freedom, with a host of shops, side content, and hidden collectibles scattered around. I have to mention for the towns too, the pre-rendered artwork that makes up the environments are wonderful. It's a shame we don't get environments like this anymore. I feel they just give an identity and character to the zones. For example, the medieval elements surrounding Alexandria as compared to the more technical and chaotic surroundings of Lindblum. It is no doubt a charming part of the game's art direction. And speaking of charming, when you visit towns, you'll also often be splitting up. The characters go their own separate ways to look for clues or advance their own personal plot in some way. As you make your way through the town, you'll periodically get these active time events, which are scenes tied to that specific character that happen at that time. Not only do they clue you in as to where that party member is, but it also lends really well to character development as you're witnessing these interactions firsthand. I do enjoy these moments because every time you visit a town it feels like an actual respite. You've travelled far, you've fought off monstrosities, and now it's time to take a load off and chill. Even still, I am also fond of the dungeon design in Final Fantasy IX. Though there are areas to explore and branching paths along with the odd puzzle here and there, they are often on the short side, and that is much more my cup of tea. But what really stands out to me is that the dungeon designs are inspired. A lot of these dungeons have an overarching theme or even mechanics that are tied directly into their makeup. My personal favourite has to be Ibsen's Castle, which is a location you visit quite late in the game. It's an upside down fortress, but that is not just for aesthetic. I mean look, I'm trying to damage these enemies but I'm dealing next to no damage. And that's because Ibsen's Castle is not only in reverse physically, it is also in reverse in nature. In other words, you will need to switch out your best equipment with your basic stuff that you got back at the start of the game. It sounds inconsequential and maybe even a bit player hostile, but the game gives you plenty of hints to let you know. There are treasure chests with basic weapons spread throughout, and there is a plaque at the beginning of the dungeon cluing you in to what this dungeon is centered around. It actually makes you adjust. There is 4 forts required, and it also makes sure that your equipment in the later stages is just as important as what you find later on. In fact, equipment in Final Fantasy IX is arguably more important than standard leveling up, which is going to bring us to the combat. The game operates with an ATB approach with up to 4 members at a time. Once the ATB gauge is full, they act, and that turn order is determined by their agility. You can also place members between the front and back row. The further forward they are, the more damage they will deal. Consequently though, being on the front line also increases the damage they take. Every member also has the ability to go into the trance mode, which opens up a special ability for a limited time. Now what I quickly latched onto with Final Fantasy IX's combat is that each character fulfills a traditional job from earlier Final Fantasy games. While I haven't played those myself, I have played Final Fantasy XIV, which pretty much has all of the jobs in Final Fantasy history stashed into one MMO package. As a result, it's really easy to identify what characters specialise in. Zidane is the thief with the ability to steal useful items, Vivi is the destructive black mage, Garnet is the white mage who heals and buffs the party, and Freya is the dragoon or dragon knight as noted in this game. And then there's Kina. For the record, bouncing back to Final Fantasy XIV here, there is a job in the game which is pretty much isolated from everything else because its mechanics simply don't mesh with the progression inherent in an MMO. That job is the Blue Mage, and it's pretty much reserved as more of a side game for players looking to farm or do some tasks individually than anything really serious. I played a Blue Mage for a grand total of about 30 minutes I'd say in my entire time with Final Fantasy XIV. It was odd, unique, and I have to say I looked on it as a bit of a joke. So when Kina came into the fold and I realised that he or she, the game actually makes a point of struggling to identify here, but I will continue with him for the rest of this video. When I realised he was a Blue Mage, I was a little apprehensive that I had just acquired a party member who was going to be useful in only select moments. Kina has the ability to eat enemies with low enough health and absorb a specific skill, so you can get AoE healing, level 5 death, and water spells just as a few examples. But Kina is anything but useless in Final Fantasy IX. He is such a fun character to use, pretty much matching the character himself as a form of comic relief. He is just absolutely busted if you get all the abilities you need. It was because of Kina that I was able to decimate anything in the early stages, because Limit Glove with Auto Rebirth was just broken. In fact, using your skills in clever and innovative ways is the staple of Final Fantasy IX's combat. Like I said before, leveling is not important in this game. It gives you some higher health pools and scales with equipment somewhat, but simply leveling will not allow you to beat the game. more import is put on your equipment, and the skills you get from them. Every character has a host of active skills and passive skills, but they learn them from the equipment they wear, not by leveling up. For example, Vivi learns all of his high-level spells like Flare and Firaga through equipping a certain staff. In other words, you can go an entire playthrough without learning them, and that extends to the passive skills too. Every character has a total amount of points they can allocate to equip these passive skills, which increase as they level up. These skills can do anything from casting haste at the beginning of a fight, to granting you immunity to status ailments. Ensuring you have an arsenal of options available to you is what defines your time with Final Fantasy IX. If you are continually building up those options, then you'll find the later parts of the game much more manageable. For instance, giving Vivi the Reflect ×2 ability and then having him attack a party member with Reflect on them will cause the damage to multiply when it hits the enemy. And there's a massive array of ways you can tackle any challenge the game throws at you. It's not all great, mind you. I do think some of the tooltips are lacking. Zidane's Lucky 7 ability, for instance, is literally described as deal physical damage by luck. Alright, well, thanks for that. What it actually means to say is that when Zidane's health ends in 7, it will deal damage equal to 7, 77, 777, or 7,777, otherwise it will always be 1. Like, yeah, the game's been out for years and you can easily just search this up, but I don't like doing that. I prefer figuring things out myself, but asinine tooltips like this force me to look up elsewhere. All in all though, the battle system in Final Fantasy IX is really good. It's a bit finicky on the PC version, some of my controller inputs were registering twice, but that's not the fault of the game itself. At its core, it encourages customization, constant progression of characters both through leveling and the skills they acquire, and never gets stale at any point. One common complaint I see with Final Fantasy IX is that the battles seemingly take too long, which I never really experienced, so very little to be annoyed with here. Well, there are definitely things that annoy me in this game though. No doubt Final Fantasy IX is loaded with optional content. Trading card games, optional character events, a massive world to explore especially later on, and a host of minigames. And while most of them were completely fine, there was one that just drove me insane. Chocobo Hot and Cold. Chocobo Hot and Cold is basically a scavenger hunt. You have 1 minute to walk around a small area while riding your chocobo, and the idea is to follow the instinct of the thick bird to find hidden items, with some of them being chocographs that lead you to special abilities for the chocobo or a bunch of items. The chocographs are what you're going for, but actually getting them is a test in patience because you are not guaranteed to get them on any run you do. In fact, the probability to get a chocograph is quite low, like 10% as a base, and the more items you find in a round, the higher the probability becomes. In a standard run, you'll get maybe 3 items before the time limit ends. The problem with Chocobo Hot and Cold though is that you have to be pinpoint accurate. The tip of the beak needs to hit that item right in the bullseye for it to register. In fact, I'm still trying to find them, but maybe this recording will give me a little bit of extra luck, so let's see how I get on this time. You see, it is an absolute pain in the arse, but thankfully, the PC version of Final Fantasy IX does provide a little crux to this. You see, if you press the F1 button, it speeds up the game, but what this means for Chocobo Hot and Cold is that the timer remains the same as if it was in real time, but the animations proceed 3 times as fast as they normally would. So with that, maybe I'll be successful, and let's see if we can get anything for our Okay. In seriousness though, having all this side content is only a good thing. There are certain parts that I don't like, but it is optional. I don't need to do it if I don't want to. And I can't disregard some of the really good stuff like the ultimate weapons, the auctions, and also the character-specific side tangents. The quest to find Vivi's adoptive father, for instance, was great. It built on information that I had already knew and added a little humorous twist to it for good measure. In fact, that's one of Final Fantasy IX's greatest strengths. It balances humour and the more serious moments really well. There's no doubt the game is full of heavy-hitting moments, but it also has a bit of light-hearted banter here and there, from the tame to the outright juvenile. I have to say that the characters are very good for the most part. They all have their own story to tell that is presented in a satisfying manner, and the way they prop each other up and interact over the course of the journey is well done. If I had to pick one though, Vivi is undoubtedly my favourite in terms of how he develops, especially when considering how integral he is to the core theme of Final Fantasy IX, which is going to segue us very nicely to the story itself. No question for me, the real highlight of Final Fantasy IX is the actual narrative. It's very clear what Final Fantasy IX's message is, and it all ties back to what Sakaguchi originally intended. Now, while this video isn't intended as an analysis of the story of Final Fantasy IX, I do want to at least give it a small yet dedicated segment because it is the best part of the game for me. Sakaguchi described the theme of Final Fantasy IX as living, and if we expand that focus, it becomes life, death, and memories. Final Fantasy IX has this at the forefront of its entire runtime. Characters display the umbrella of death through loss, grief, and acceptance throughout the story, and how they grow from that is what makes it so impactful. It's very clear what the intended message of the game was by the end, and it's quite interesting to me because I played a game this year, very recently in fact, that had a similar goal for its story. I don't really want to say what that game is, as I'm sure some people have yet to play it, but I don't think either that game or Final Fantasy IX do it better than the other. I feel that's more a disservice to how each game went about it. The core message is the same, but they both present it and answer it in notably different ways. Compared to its contemporary, I feel that Final Fantasy IX is a lot more direct with how it handles the theme of death. It clearly uses two characters as the foil to present it, with Vivi being one half of that whole. The other half is clearly the game's main antagonist in Kuja. Both of them effectively come from a similar origin, they were made for a specific purpose, but both ultimately defy their fate. The results though were completely different. One went mad from the truth and aimed to live forever, while the other looked to live a life of meaning in the short space of time they had. And it all comes full circle come that ending sequence. When I first started reading these lines at the climax of Final Fantasy IX, I initially thought this was Zidane, but very soon after, it became clear that these were actually the words of Vivi. It's bittersweet really, because at that point I realised that Vivi had passed away during that undefined jump in time, while everyone else returned to Alexandria where it all started. Vivi was the only one who wasn't there. Instead, his legacy lived on in his children, but Vivi himself would never actually be gone in that sense, even if his offspring never existed, because even though he is no longer present in the world, his memory lives on in the friends he made. Final Fantasy IX has a memorable story. It is one that sticks in the mind and gets you to think, to question, and to ultimately come up with your own opinions. While I don't think it's entirely perfect, I do hold the opinion there are characters like Queen Bran who are not handled as well as they could have been. The vast majority of it is strikingly impactful, reinforced further with its brilliant OST, which I dare not use in this video for fear of Squarebot slamming down the copyright hammer. And that ultimately encompasses my overall thoughts on Final Fantasy IX. I don't consider it to be perfect, and I do feel it has aged in certain areas, but it's similar to what Skies of Arcadia was for me earlier in the year. It's a situation where if I played it back at the time of release, then I probably would have looked on it as one of the best JRPGs ever made. Heck, I still see Sonic Adventure 2 as the best of the franchise despite its obvious flaws. And that's purely because I played it right when it first released on the Dreamcast, and those memories stick fondly within my mind even to this day. The reality is that it is impossible to pull myself back to that period to truly comprehend what a game was like when it first came out. All I can do is compare it to what I have already played up till now, and there are points about it that I consider to be shortcomings, like the odd minigame or its lacking tooltips. But just like its narrative, the vast majority of Final Fantasy IX is at a very high level, even to this day. And I'm thankful that I finally got around to playing it. In a way, I envy the people who played it back at the turn of the millennium. It's ironic really that one of the core themes of Final Fantasy IX is the concept of memories, because I dare say those memories of their first time with the game still live on even now. Thank you for watching this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe for more JRPG content, and consider joining my Patreon if you're interested. Peace!